Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, to celebrate Halloween and the heights of spooky season, we conclude our discussion of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, covering chapters 6 through 9. That will carry us through to the end of the story and the conclusion to what is, as I've said before, and will say again, arguably, if not definitively, the greatest haunted house novel that there is. We're going to have a lot to discuss tonight, though. Our discussion tonight is going to take a slightly odd form because the reading sets some special challenges for us in the context of this show because of the usual structures that horror novels take. That is to say, long, slow setups in which we establish character, we establish theme, we establish setting, certainly, mechanism, certainly. We establish all of the motifs that are going to crash into each other, that are going to come into play right at the end of the book, and then we get our punchy conclusion, introducing very little that is new, but really heightening, exaggerating, exemplifying, taking all of these ideas that we've established so far and carrying them to their apotheosis or their breaking point. Your metaphor of choice may vary, and that is certainly true of this book. The truth is that we have hit all of the major mechanics of The Haunting of Hill House basically by the time that we get to the first night, the noisy first night in the house. After that, we've really got most of our building blocks. We've got most of our essential elements, and what follows thereafter is a heightening, a texturing, an increase in intensity, and a destabilization of our relationship to the book. We're going to be observing, if not talking a great deal about, unreliable narration tonight as the narrative position, the narrative perspective of the book becomes increasingly unanchored. It is going to become increasingly fluid, increasingly deceptive, and increasingly difficult to actually definitively pin down. There are going to be moments where I think that what is being described to us unambiguously on the page is actually extremely ambiguous. It's actually not happening at all, I would argue, but we'll get to some of that as we double down on many of the topics that we introduced last week, particularly unreliable narration, and of course these questions of identity that really carry us through to the end of the book. Hugh is joining me here live. It is morning for Hugh, though it is Halloween for me here in the great state of Oklahoma. Hugh, I hope that you are having a good morning already. And I know that, Elizabeth is going to be joining us live later too. She is right now in the other room finishing the book. That is how our schedule has been this week. I hope that yours has been better. Okay, let's get to the beginning of chapter 6 and the introduction of a really interesting set of conversations. I think chapter 6 is so fascinating because it is such a turning point in the book, and yet the ways in which it is turning us are by no means clear. We're spending a lot of time kind of gesturing at the shape of something that we cannot track, I think, until arguably chapter 8. I think it is in chapter 8 that the consequence of these conversations, or at least the direct consequence of the experiences that Eleanor is having at this moment, really come into focus for us as readers. Between here and there, we get a lot of nebulous kind of thematic stuff happening, right? We are aware of great import, but not perhaps aware of any great specificity. And then, of course, that is deliberately interrupted, deliberately exploded by the forceful intrusion and the reframing, the rebracketing of the story by the presence of Mrs. Montague and Arthur, about whom we shall have some things to say in just a minute. Right, let's get into the beginning of chapter 6 and this scene shared here between Eleanor and Luke. I am learning the pathways of the heart, Eleanor thought quite seriously, and then wondered what she could have meant by thinking any such thing. It was afternoon, and she sat in the sunlight on the steps of the summer house beside Luke. There were these are the silent pathways of the heart, she thought. She knew that she was pale and still shaken, with dark circles under her eyes, but the sun was warm and the leaves moved gently overhead, and Luke beside her lay lazily against the step. Luke, she asked, going slowly for fear of ridicule, why do people want to talk to each other? I mean, what are the things people always want to find out about other people? What do you want to know about me, for instance? He laughed. She thought, but why not ask what he wants to know about me? He is so extremely vain, and laughed in turn and said, what can I ever know about you beyond what I see? See was the least of the words she might have chosen, but the safest. Tell me something that only I will ever know, was perhaps what she wanted to ask him, or what will you give me to remember you by, or even nothing of the least importance has ever belonged to me. Can you help? Then she wondered if she had been foolish or bold, amazed at her own thoughts. But he only stared down at the leaf he held in his hands and frowned a little, as one who devotes himself completely to an absorbing problem. He's trying to phrase everything to make as good an impression as possible, she thought, and I will know how he holds me by what he answers. How is he anxious to appear to me? Does he think that I will be content with small mysticism, or will he exert himself to seem unique? Is he going to be gallant? That would be humiliating, because then he would show that he knows that gallantry enchants me. Will he be mysterious? Mad? And how am I to receive this? Will I perceive what which I perceive already will be a confidence, even if it is not true? Grant that Luke take me at my worst, she thought, or at least let me not see the difference. Let him be wise, or let me be blind. Don't let me, she hoped concretely, don't let me know too surely what he thinks of me. So, we discussed a little last week about these tokens of identity that become, in their aggregate form, in their kind of syncretic form, I suppose, greater than the sum of their parts. That you are, yes, composed of all the constituent things that you are, but you are also more than that. And one of the ways in which you become more than that, or one of the ways in which that moreness is illuminated, is in the contrast between two people, the connection between two people, the conversation between two people, this idea of the Socratic dialogue, that truth cannot be contained fully within one heart, but can only exist in that fleeting moment between two. And this, I think, is one of the things that we're moving toward. But of course, we're not moving toward this in terms of Eleanor and Luke, or not entirely between Eleanor and Luke, because we are mindful, I think, of the other presence that is here. I am learning the pathways of the heart, Eleanor thought quite seriously, and then wondered what she could have meant by thinking any such thing. This is not the first time that Eleanor has had a thought that does not seem to belong to her. It certainly will not be the last. But now we are positioning Eleanor, well, again, right, always with this asterisk of the power of the reader to interpret this story in any way that the reader feels justified. Is Eleanor simply a victim of her own life experience thus far? Does she suffer from this kind of achingly naive and vulnerable and adolescent arrested development? Is that a thing that we can say with certainty of Eleanor? Or is there something more supernatural? Or is it kind of both? Are both things happening here at the same time? But here we see her positioning herself with Luke, not just in terms of I am a woman and you are a man, right? We've talked before about the ways in which femininity is presented, or rather presumed to be, partially performative for the benefit of the men in the household. I should have just said the patriarchy and continued that alliterative run of peas, but for some reason I chose not to. My courage failed me in that final moment. But there is this idea of performance as a means of generating intimacy, right? We saw this early in the book with Eleanor and Theodora, when they are firstly kind of making up stories or fabricating family details and kind of overlooking the absence of any real shared history in order to generate this immediate intimacy, and then making stories up together in order to generate that intimacy. That's a very real phenomenon. That is a thing that people do in real life. But here we're getting a completely different take on the same kind of setup, which is one of these things that makes me wonder, how much is this Eleanor? And how much is this something other than Eleanor, greater than Eleanor? How much is this Eleanor plus, right? Why do people want to talk to each other? I mean, what are the things people always want to find out about other people? It's such a, this is my first day on earth, take me to your leader kind of question to ask, right? It is humanity 101, and not just the idea that other people are important but also fundamentally unknowable, which is true, but also this idea that society functions on a kind of social lubrication. You need a kind of mechanism that is generative of intimacy, right? You cannot possibly run a society in which every superficial connection is treated as though it is superficial, right? You need to be able to generate real moments of human connection in order for society to function. That's why small talk exists. That's why we all kind of play these somewhat ritualistic formal games. Hey, how are you doing? I'm great. How are you doing? That's awesome. I'm so glad to hear it. Hey, I have a question for you, right? We do the necessary dance to enkindle a kind of intimacy. And this is not to suggest that it's exploitative. It's just how human beings function at a very basic kind of level. It is ultimately kind of hollow, but it is also, generative of, as I say, exactly that kind of intimacy. And Hugh's asking here in the chat, of course, exactly, as is your way, Hugh, putting your finger right on the relevant question. The house, Hugh asks, has questions. And that's certainly a tempting idea, right? I mean, I've been very evasive over the course of the last couple of weeks as we've been discussing The Haunting of Hill House, and I do want to make space because I do recognize this as an ambiguous text, right? I recognize this as a book that allows for all of these various readings, but that doesn't mean that I want to leave you with the idea that there is no final reading, that there is no, kind of most substantial interpretive maneuver that we can make. So one of the things that I want to kind of leap on already, one of the steps that I want to take now so that we can have this already established as we move through the end of the book is simply this. The house is supernatural. Something here is happening, right? There is something, there is an element of haunting that is in Hill House. Hill House is haunted. Now, the first question that you ask as you're considering this is the house haunted, or is Eleanor haunting the house? And the answer, I think, is both. I think that there is a reciprocal connection here between the house and Eleanor. Not just Eleanor. I do not think that she brought the entirety of this thing with her. There are obviously other connections to the Cranes, right? Particularly to the children. We're going to circle back to some of that later in the book. But it is clear that there is a personal connection, a deep personal connection between Eleanor and the house. And what is so gratifying about that, of course, is that that is exactly what Dr. Montague wanted. And then he proves himself to be completely inadequate to its analysis, to its investigation, to its research. He cannot really fundamentally understand it. We'll circle back to him right at the end of tonight's session. But yes, for my money, for my read, Eleanor is entangled with the house. There is, and well, let me put it this way. This carries us to the idea of identity. It carries us to these themes of identity that have been established, these contradictory themes of identity that have been established, but also forces us to confront some very complicated questions about exactly how identity is manifested here, right? Because it's one thing to say that Eleanor and the house are entangled, but it's quite another to say, what does that mean? What is the house? What functionally, representatively here? Because we can be comfortable with the idea that there are other spirits, ghosts, entities, whatever, in the house, right? But, and also I suppose that the house itself has a presence. We'll talk a little more about that in just a moment. But I want to interrogate this idea of what Hill House is vis-a-vis Eleanor and how they are connected and what that connection means, rather than just taking it as, well, there is a ghost and that ghost and Eleanor are connected somehow. That's why I think we're spending this time on connection here in this conversation with Luke as we're moving forward. And we're going to spend a lot of time doing this kinds of things. Hugh's saying here, Eleanor provides a conduit for the house to speak. And that is certainly true, though that is clearly reciprocal too, right? The house also informs Eleanor, right? The house acts as an extension of Eleanor, but there are these moments which are clearly not Eleanor's own thoughts and Eleanor's own preoccupations. And how far we take that, specifically in terms of Eleanor's attributing to the people around her motivation and inclination and preference and explanation, right? When we're particularly thinking about Theodora, how much of Eleanor's response to Theodora is purely Eleanor, how much it is kind of hybridized with the house, and how much it is the malign influence of the house is open for debate and speculation. We'll get to some of that in just a moment. Okay, let's call up the slide again just to make sure that I haven't missed anything from it. And no, I think we're pretty good. I think we've largely covered some of this material, except I do want to call out in that second para there. Again, we're back to this idea of these tokens of identity, right? Tell me something only I will ever know, was perhaps what she wanted to ask him, or what will you give me to remember you by, or even nothing of the least importance has ever belonged to me, can you help? And that's such a fascinating progression there, right? Tell me something that only I will ever know, right? Create an intimacy with me right now. Tell me something that is true that you won't tell anyone else. That's kind of important. That's kind of vital. It bonds us in this moment, right? The keeping, not necessarily of a secret exactly, that's not exactly how I would formulate it, but of private and privileged information. Show me that I am important by entrusting me with a piece of information is an extremely intimate thing to do with someone. And that is one of the things that Eleanor wants here, right? Or what will you give me to remember you by is kind of the same thing, but it is less connected. It is less intimate, right? You are then completely yielding the token of identity over to the other person. You are kind of relinquishing your own hold on it. A secret is a thing that is shared between two people and thus creates a bond. Give me something as a token of our relationship is subtly different, because the giver of the gift kind of passes out of the relationship at that point, is supplanted in the relationship, right? This is the purpose of give me a token to remember you by, means that you are replaced by the token, effectively, right? Functionally, immediately. Or, as she refines this idea down, nothing of the least importance has ever belonged to me. Can you help? Just, I want something that is important and mine. Which, of course, ties us back to the Cup of Stars. It ties us back to the awful complexity of the car that Eleanor co-owns but does not own at all, right? There are these ideas of being and belonging that are externalized into the things that we own. I think that's why Eleanor lies about her tidy little apartment where everything is perfect, right? You'll remember she's decorating it slowly because everything has to be exactly right. And she folds in the story of the Cup of Stars, and she folds in the stone lions that she saw as she was driving to Hill House in the first place. She's kind of cherry picking these ideas because she wants these things to belong to her in a way that is personal, in a way that is immediate. More on this later. Right after this, we get the two quick beats, which aren't surprising, but we'll still call them out. The first is the note of envy that we get from Eleanor when she wonders if Theodora knows Luke this well, right? This weird combative relationship between Theodora, Eleanor, and Luke, this love triangle kind of thing that is at least how Eleanor interprets it. Though, again, as I'm rereading this book, I'm being struck more and more powerfully by the queer reading, and I think that the queer reading is completely unavoidable at this stage, so I'm not at all sure how much Theodora is into Luke, given the importance of the other romantic relationship. You know what, I'm going to put that pin in that for just now, because we are definitely going to circle back to that after Eleanor invites herself to come and stay with Theodora. So we have this weird jealous relationship when it comes to Luke, which we'll circle back to later. And then we have the second beat, the revelation that Luke didn't have a mother growing up, which ironically he credits for his own sense of Arrested Development. Luke, in the absence of a mother, never had cause to grow up. He says as much explicitly, while Eleanor, laboring under obligation to her mother, never had the opportunity to grow up. They are, in many ways, two sides here of the same coin. They're here, they're talking, they're intimate, they're connected, and yet, well, I was about to say that neither can see each other's experience or really understand the connection, but I'm not at all sure that that is correct. I'm not at all sure that Luke is as oblivious to what Eleanor wants here as Eleanor presents him as being. This is one of these moments where, well, this is, one of the moments in the book. This is the part of the book, I guess, where this question of unreliable narration becomes almost inescapable. Eleanor is wanting this thing. She is crediting to Luke this disingenuity, right? She is crediting or attributing to Luke this shamelessness, right? This desire to manipulate her into seeing him the way that he wants to be seen, trying to second guess what it is that she wants from him, right? So she's aware even in that moment of her own disingenuity, I suppose, right? There's some kind of reciprocal performance that is happening here, that she wants to manipulate him into not manipulating her, into seeing him the way that he wants her to see him, because she wants him to see her the way that she wants him to see her. That's a tangled paragraph, if ever there was one, but I think that the idea is strong. But what's interesting here, right, and what I think we can credit to Luke, perhaps, is that Luke might see that relationships with their mothers is a thing that connects them, right? That is a thing. He misunderstands it, right? He's got completely the wrong end of Eleanor's relationship with her mother. You're lucky, he says, you had a mother, which probably not, actually, right? But nonetheless, he is sensitive enough to understand that that is important. Which kind of brings us back to this underpinning idea, right? The idea with which Eleanor starts this chapter, starts this passage. Why do people want to talk to each other? What is the purpose of conversation? What is this desire for deeper connection? Why do we want it? Why is it important? And maybe it's important because it's the generation of intimacy, because it's the creation or the discovery or the reinforcement, this spark between two people that reminds us that we are not alone, that tells us that we are in some way important to one another, if in no objective, abstracted, universal kind of way. And That's the perfect note, if ever I've heard one, for Elizabeth to appear in the chat. Good evening, Elizabeth, who has, as I say, just finished the book. I imagine, Elizabeth, that you are reeling right now. I imagine you are just shook, as the kids would say. We'll get to the very end of the book in just a little while. I mentioned the specifics of these conversations here between Eleanor and Luke. I'm spending a lot of time here right at the beginning of chapter 6 of 4 chapters that we have to cover tonight. And I'm mentioning all of this at the cost of dwelling on the framing of Eleanor's own experience now, right? It has been true since the first night in Hill House, though now we can see very clearly. It has been true that Eleanor's position as an unreliable narrator of her own experience is right there on the page. She freely attributes all of these motivations and qualities to other people in the house. She borrows the authority of that narrative voice. But a careful read of the text may well lead us to interpret the actions of the other characters in a very different way. I suppose the first time that this happens is Theodora making her angry in order to kind of diffuse her hysteria, right? A very psychologically dubious path, like not a great strategy, honestly, but it is one of those moments where everyone else seems to be in on it, and Eleanor plays the part of being in on it, but also harbors this initial resentment. I know that there are readers out there, and I find this bewildering. I know that there are readers out there who come away from this book believing that Theodora is awful, that Theodora is a monstrous character, which I find so surprising because A, Mrs. Montague exists in this book, so by comparison, everyone else is delightful, and B, I am generally disinclined to read Eleanor's account of Theodora's behavior as genuine, or if not genuine, then accurately motivated, right? Particularly as Eleanor retreats from the focus of the story, becoming more and more, quite literally, a part of the scenery. More on this later. And this is all part of a broader thought, I suppose, because I've been thinking this week about what a strange and temporary idea narrative authority is, right? Because you can only have an unreliable narrator if the narrator of any given text is coasting on the assumed authority that you give to the narrator of a novel, because you assume that that is a position of some natural authority. I've mentioned before, quite recently, in fact, that of course the first novels in English were epistolary in nature. They're collections of letters by which the reader could glean the story. But this is done in part because the idea of the in-fiction narrative voice hadn't been completely refined yet. We just didn't know how to read novels because the novel was not a fully mature form as yet. So this leads to eventually to the idea of the narrative voice, who is quite often clearly personified, particularly as you move through the 19th century. And then it is a small step to the scandalous idea of the unreliable narrator, who gets their authority, as I say, from the form of the novel itself. And of course, this is, I'm talking narrative here in the modern novelistic sense, right? The idea of unreliable narration extends back to like ancient Greek theater and every culture since. But I'm just somewhat preoccupied with the thought that the definitions and the archetypes that we associate with unreliable narration really don't arrive. They're not defined in English until 1960s, right? It's Booth and the Rhetoric of Fiction, and that's so modern and so fleeting, because I really do think that now we have arrived at a postmodern perspective on texts, by which we almost presume, right? This is what M. Night Shyamalan has done to us. We now presume that the narrative is messing with us in some way. Maybe more on that some other day in the future. So from this point on, we're going to pick up some speed here as we move through the book. We follow with the discovery of the scrapbook, right, compiled by Hugh Crane for his daughter Sophia, featuring these stern injunctions and outright threats to ensure that little Sophia lives a good Christian life. We could spend an entire episode looking very carefully at every element of the scrapbook. I did look around earlier today to see if anyone had really pulled apart the visual art references. What have we got? We've got the Goya and the Blake and so on, because this is not my area of expertise, but I couldn't find anything comprehensive. I want to read about this a great deal, so I'm going to keep looking, and if I find anything, I will post it over in the Patreon Discord, I think. But the larger point here, right, is well, I think it's the iconography. There is the element of religious iconography, right, which does seem to be leveraging ideas of guilt and shame and sin, certainly, right, as well as the idea of the ordered and disordered life, the ordered and the disordered world. One of the very few ways in which it is striking that this novel is set in 1959 is the conversation that we get later between Mrs. Dudley and Mrs. Montague, in which they're talking about promiscuous children and describing, people in their 20s and 30s, by the way, but they're talking about promiscuous children and whether or not it's okay that they all came to this house in the middle of nowhere and shacked up for the summer, which is such an interesting idea in terms of these notions of like heavily Christian sin. But I'm going to tell you, I don't think that the purpose of the scrapbook here is necessarily entangled in the story as it's presented to us, right? Do we draw a sharp connection between Sophia Crane and the child within the house, right? The specter of the child within the house? We might. That is a tempting bit of interpretation. That is a tempting and even strong interpretive maneuver, but by no means comprehensive there. But I think that the other thing that Jackson is doing at this point is pulling in and calling upon and even exploiting the iconography of horror itself. It feels as though this scrapbook should be revelatory. It should contain the clues, right? This is what, here we are in the second act. This scrapbook should tell us everything that we need to know in order to defeat the spirit of Hill House at the end of the book. If this is a modern horror movie, not the not the A24 kind of horror movies, I guess, which would be much more bleak and existential. But if this is a kind of by the numbers, franchisey horror movie, then that is exactly what happens, right? If this stars Ethan Hawke, for example, then that's how it plays out. That's the end of the story, is we get the clues from the book and then we can resolve the problem. But that's not where we are. That's not the kind of story that we are. And though this religious iconography is invoked here very powerfully, very graphically, very deeply, very complexly, it falls out of the story almost immediately, which I find completely fascinating. We're going to skip ahead to Theodora by the Fire, but I do want to call on Elizabeth's comment here about Theodora. I like Theodora, says Elizabeth, but she falls into a common bisexual trope of wanting everyone to be attracted to her because she's attracted to everyone. She strikes me as someone who adores everyone and wants to be adored in return, but I do think she's sincere. She's flawed, but no more than the rest of them and less than some. Yeah, I think that's fascinating, right? I think that's, but again, I would say that interpretation is anchored in this perspective that we get from Eleanor, and Eleanor attributing to, yeah. How do we read Theodora and Luke? Is there a desire to be wanted? Is there a flirty kind of sexual chemistry thing happening here? You can certainly, I think, interpret it that way. Is there a different kind of relationship that Eleanor lacks the vocabulary and experience to define and explore, right? I don't know. There is just ambiguity there, and I find that so fascinating. You're right, though. I hadn't thought about Theodora being the predatory bisexual, right? This idea that because you can be attracted to everyone, you therefore want everyone to be attracted to you, which is, you're right, kind of hack. Speaking of Theodora, let's get right to her here as she sits by the fire. Hey, look, slide 2, something like half an hour into tonight's session. Theodora curled by the fire, looking up wickedly at Eleanor. At the other end of the room, the chessmen moved softly, jarring with little sounds against the table, and Theodora spoke gently, tormentingly. Will you have him at your little apartment now, and offer him to drink from your cup of stars? Eleanor looked into the fire, not answering. I've been so silly, she thought. I have been a fool. Is there room enough for 2? Would he come if you asked him? Nothing could be worse than this, Eleanor thought. I have been a fool. Perhaps he has been longing for a tiny home, something smaller, of course, than Hill House. Perhaps he will come home with you. A fool, a ludicrous fool. Your white curtains, your tiny stone lions. Eleanor looked down at her, almost gently. But I had to come, she said, and stood up, turning blindly to get away. Not hearing the startled voices behind her, not seeing where or how she went, she blundered somehow to the great front door and out into the soft, warm night. I had to come, she said to the world outside. So here we are, right? Here's the crux of the thing. Let's do some close reading. Let's do some real on-the-page analysis here. Theodora asking Eleanor these questions in a way that obviously Eleanor is taking as mockery, as ridicule, right? She is again feeling the shame of her actions. This is exactly like waking up that first morning, feeling that anxiety, feeling that pressure, that belief that she had done or said something that has made her appear foolish in the eyes of others. And we get a kind of recapitulation of that, though it's more present, it's more immediate here because it is perhaps more targeted. Now, The question is Theodora teasing Eleanor? Well, no, wait. I think she's pretty clearly teasing Eleanor. Is Theodora teasing maliciously? Is she speaking gently or tormentingly, right? Which half of that descriptive comparison do we draw on here to really understand it? As she's exploring this idea of the relationship with Luke, is she mocking Eleanor or not? And clearly Eleanor believes that she is, right? And certainly we can interpret that. Nothing could be worse than this. Eleanor thought, I have been a fool. So not just this is a bad experience, but it's a bad experience that I deserve because I have been foolish, right? She's internalizing, which is one of those things. This is one of those red flags that makes me think immediately, hey, I don't know about this, right? If her response had been, hey, screw you, stop teasing me about Luke, then I would think, yes, Theodora is probably doing this objectively. But the fact that Eleanor has already completed that phase 1 of internalization, to me, is disquieting. But I think that we have a pretty clear sign here that Eleanor is not completely alone in her thoughts, alone in her mind, that there is another presence here, there is another awareness here with her, and B, Theodora is perhaps not being tormenting, that she is not being at least malevolent, that she is not making fun of Eleanor here, and it comes in that last para, right? Eleanor looked down at her almost gently, but I had to come, she said, which is not a riposte to what Theodora was just saying, right? Theodora is saying, after this is over, do you think Luke's going to come and hang out at your pad? Do you think he's going to come stop by with a bottle of wine and maybe, pet your stone lions, if you know what I mean? Innuendo very heavily implied. But that is not the answer that Eleanor gives. She's not responding to this question about Luke. She's responding to this idea that her apartment is not real, right? She's kind of assuming the knowledge on the part of Theodora that the story of her apartment is in fact a lie. But I had to come, she said, and stood up, turning blindly to get away, not hearing the startled voices behind her, right? So she stands up all at once. She runs out of the room, and everyone is startled. And by everyone, we can assume that we're including there Theodora, right? And they don't see where or how she went. Now, here's the trick. How do we know that there are startled voices behind her if she doesn't hear them? This is the great virtue of this kind of close not quite first person writing, casually using first person as though that word didn't have, or that phrase didn't have an entirely specific and well-defined meaning. This is extremely close third person, right? But we are very much in Eleanor's head from the beginning of the book, right? We have that introduction to all of our characters. Then the camera kind of glides down like you're playing a first-person video game. You kind of get the cinematic shot of the landscape, and you see your character, right, standing on the cliff looking down over the area where this adventure will take place, and the camera kind of floats in and through the back of the character's head, and now you are in first person, right? We kind of get that effect right there at the beginning of the book, and then we're very close to Eleanor for the rest of the book. But now we start getting things that Eleanor, ambiguously at least, cannot know, or should not know, or does not know, right? Not hearing the startled voices behind her, not seeing where or how she went, she blundered somehow to the great front door and out into the soft, warm night. I had to come, she said, to the world outside. What is the world outside? Well, the world outside is the place that she goes, ironically, to commune with the house, right? That quite often she will go outside and the house will take a greater or take a clearer shape. Let's, in fact, look at the next passage, because I think that is quite relevant here, because we get the sequence with Theodora and Eleanor walking around the house, right? We get them also walking outside, taking the path through the forest. Is this not, by the way, in a very direct way, a recapitulation of the first line of the chapter? Is this not Eleanor learning the pathways of the heart here as she's walking through the forest around the house with Theodora? And we are really sharpening our focus on the queer reading, on the tangled complexity of the relationship between these two women, which is, let me lay this out here, right? Because we have two women, neither of whom is capable of telling the truth, right? Because Theodora's position is vulnerable. It is 1959, and her position is vulnerable, and Eleanor is perhaps equally vulnerable in a different way, right? But also actively lying, right? They are in this moment together, exploring these pathways of the heart, which leads them both literally and metaphorically to the vision of the picnic, to the sun-drenched lawn and the girl in the scarlet sweater and the mother figure at the heart of the whole thing. And we crash out there into horror, and we're going to look at that passage in just a moment. But I want to present here the idea, my interpretation, that in fact, Theodora is attracted to Eleanor and has been attracted to Eleanor basically from the jump. And perhaps it's a, it's a rebound thing because things went so badly with her partner, right? But I think that right from the jump, there is an enormous intimacy and enormous chemistry between the two of them. So I tend to read Theodora's relationship with Luke, particularly here at the end of the book, not as being the figure, as Elizabeth points out, of the cliched figure of the rapacious bisexual, right? But actually something more like a girl who is kind of getting her heart messed around with, right? Because Eleanor is so warm and then so cold. You remember that moment where Theodora reaches out to touch her and Eleanor forcefully removes her hand. It's just a really difficult thing. Hugh says, I suspect that we shouldn't read too much into possible gayness. I think fools in the 1950s had underdeveloped gaydar. I mean, that is true, right? Which is why I think we can include that in this book, that were this book released in exactly this form this year, it would not be subtext. It would be clear to us that, again, preserving the ambiguity, we'd be playing with the idea that Eleanor is so sheltered and so naive in the ways of the world that she's not interpreting it as queerness, that she's not interpreting Theodora's interest in her as being romantic or as being sexual. But yeah, I think that there is something interesting happening there. As I say, Jackson had a really interesting position vis-a-vis the queerness of her characters in her book. She was not addressing directly Theodora, I think, but she did talk very publicly about characters in other books who were supposed to be queer and were present on the page. And there had been a very kind of conservative pushback against it. But of course, we must remember that Jackson is also, in addition to being brilliant, an enormously commercial author. She is concerned with selling a lot of books. She likes selling a lot of books. She likes being popular, and that, a political position is maybe not the first thing that she wants to adopt here. We must move on here. To conclude, I think I have pulled more slides from the very brief chapter 6 than I have from the rest of this evening combined. But here we're going to conclude chapter 6 with the flight from the. Oh no! I guess did I miss it? Oh no! I meant to take the. Yep. No, I think I maybe pulled the wrong piece here. This is the flight from the picnic scene. Actually, this is later that evening, isn't it? This is the recreation of the noise in the hallway here. This is terrible. I'm sorry that I've pulled the wrong slide here. I guess we're just going to pass over it, right? Because what we're going to do there, it's great anyway. All of that is to say that it's very effective horror writing, and we can move on because this is the wrong slide that I have pulled for sure. It's been a process putting together this week's reading, so I apologize for that. Let me come back to my camera and I will check my slides and see if in fact there's we're gonna move ahead into chapter 7 here. I think maybe several of these have gone awry. This is terrible. Yes, okay. Let me I do apologize. Okay. Nope, I just didn't pull that one. Okay, in any case, we move into chapter 7. We introduce Mrs. Montague. We introduce Arthur, both of whom are different means by which we refresh the perspective of the reader. We emphasize how close our core cast have become, how isolated they have become, right? As though this is a reality TV show. They are now... They have kind of developed their own society within the house. They've developed their own rules. They've developed their own way of working. And they've been soaking in the house. They've been floating in it. They've been experiencing it rather than mapping it, rather than exploring it, rather than seeking to solve it. Dr. Montague has the information that he comes in with, and we get this brief examination, the brief scientific inquiry of the cold spot outside the nursery door, but everything else has been extremely reactive, right? As is emphasized by Mrs. Montague's exhausting commitment to her own pseudoscientific bit. She's established here as being fiercely rational, fiercely driven, in counterpoint to Eleanor and Theodora, just as Arthur is presented as being extremely capable and physical and masculine as a counterpoint to Dr. Montague and Luke, or I guess to take that a little further, Jackson is bracketing the capabilities and experiences and inclinations of our core cast by presenting us with a figure who is more rational than anyone that we have seen and more physical than anyone that we have seen, right? It is Arthur's job to patrol the house at night. He is physically present and capable in a way that neither Dr. Montague or Luke are. So we're kind of isolating and drawing together our core cast, our four main characters here by presenting, you know, the extremes of this particular spectrum here. Mrs. Montague is awful, just awful. We get the brief beat in which Theodora confides in Eleanor that Luke never had a mother, right? Which we're echoing there. We have that moment of wondering from Eleanor, is Theodora this close to Luke? And it turns out that in fact she is. And this reminder that Eleanor's thoughts, right? We have this recurring beat throughout the novel that Eleanor will think something and then Theodora will respond to it, will acknowledge it, will move into it, right? There's some kind of implicit communication there, which may not be an implicit communication at all. Of course, if you're taking the cynical approach to The Haunting of Hill House, that you just assume that in fact Eleanor thinks that she is thinking this thing and instead is actually saying it out loud or is murmuring it or something like that. But there is this idea that Eleanor's thoughts have a certain weight, there's a certain response here. This is important. We're going to circle back to it because in the next scene we get the invocation of, again, right, Shirley Jackson playing with the tropes of the haunted house. We've done the book of you know, stern religious iconography, and now we're going to get the scene with Mrs. Montague post planchette, this evocation of the mysterious nun, the hooded monk, the vague dark figure, and you know, some surprising specificity about repeated words as she reports the finding of the planchette upstairs, right? She gets the Elizabeth's talking so much smack on Mrs. Montague here in the chat that the auto moderator turned off the message. I don't even know if I can allow that message right now. I guess I can't. I need to turn off auto moderation. We're all adults here. You can say what you like. But we have this idea that the communication with the planchette has in fact delivered not a nun who has been imprisoned within the walls with a single candle and a glass of water or whatever it was, but rather it is Nell, that it is Eleanor that it is referring to, right? We get that sequence, and then we get the last part. We get this idea of repeated words, as Mrs. Montague says, right? The spirits speaking through the planchette, they like to alight upon a certain word or a certain phrase and then repeat it over and over, which is, of course, a trait that we associate with Eleanor, right? From Journey's End and Lovers' Meetings all the way down to I Have Been a Fool, as we just saw on the last slide. And then we get this brief exchange between Arthur and Mrs. Montague. What do you want? Arthur read. Mother. Mrs. Montague read back. Why? Child. Where is your mother? Home. Where is your home? Lost, lost, lost. And after that, Mrs. Montague said, folding the paper briskly, there was nothing but gibberish. So that night, now that we've come all the way back to where we were with that slide, we get another series of bangs and crashes and things going bump in the night. And this is the slide that I pulled earlier. So, it can't get in. Theodora was whispering over and over, her eyes on the door. It can't get in. Don't let it get in. It can't get in. The shaking stopped. The door was quiet, and a little caressing touch began on the doorknob, feeling intimately and softly, and then, because the door was locked, patting and fondling the door frame as though wheedling to be let in. It knows we're here, Eleanor whispered, and Luke, looking back over his shoulder, gestured furiously for her to be quiet. It is so cold, Eleanor thought childishly. I will never be able to sleep again with all this noise coming from inside my head. How can these others hear the noise when it is coming from inside my head? I am disappearing inch by inch into this house. I am going apart a little bit at a time because all this noise is breaking me. Why are the others frightened? She was aware dully that the pounding had begun again. The metallic, overwhelming sound of it washed over her like waves. She put her cold hands to her mouth to feel if her face was still there. I've had enough, she thought. I am too cold. So this is, well, with classic Jacksonian ambiguity, right? This is either, if you like, the proof that Eleanor is feeling the noises within her, that they are happening within her head and happening in the outside world, and that these things are connected somehow, or that these things are happening within her head and happening in the outside world, and that these things are the same somehow, right? That there is either a spatial resonance between the thing that Eleanor is feeling, that's, or not really literally spatial, of course, right? But like an experiential resonance, that she is feeling this within her as the others are feeling it without her. Or that there is a growing connection, an almost physical connection, a transcendent connection between what is inside of Eleanor and what is inside of the house. That Eleanor and the house are becoming, as she implies here, right? I am disappearing inch by inch into this house. I am going apart a little bit at a time because all this noise is breaking me. I think of like the vibration of a jackhammer here, just grinding parts of Eleanor's being, Eleanor's identity away, grinding them to nothing, or merging her with the house. You know, I think of that line about the veranda, the porch, going around the house and holding it tight like a belt, as though it is keeping the disparate parts of the house together. And now here is Eleanor feeling very much the same kind of experience. We're seeing here that her consciousness, her sense of identity is merging with the house. This carries us into chapter 8, the penultimate chapter. And this is where we observe, inarguably, this is where we are really hit with the idea that Eleanor is retreating from the story itself. Several times over the course of this chapter, we are going to situate her very clearly as an observer, as a witness, and even then, an imperfect one, a kind of oddly abstracted one. We'll get to those scenes in a moment, because of course we start with something a little more striking here. "I'm coming with you," Eleanor said. "Coming where with me?" "Back with you, back home. And Eleanor smiled wryly. "I'm going to follow you home." Theodora stared. "Why?" she said blankly. "I never had anyone to care about," Eleanor said, wondering where she had heard someone say something like this before. "I want to be someplace where I belong." "I'm not in the habit of taking home stray cats," Theodora said lightly. Eleanor laughed too. "I am a kind of stray cat, aren't I?" "Well," Theodora took up her pencil again, "you have your own home," she said. "You'll be glad enough to get back to it when the time comes. Nell, my Nellie, I suppose we'll all be glad to get back home. What are you saying about those noises last night? I can't describe them." "I'll come, Eleanor said. "I'll just come." So obviously queer reading, right? Queer reading, again, giving us some insight. It's so interesting here that as Eleanor kind of retreats from the text, we are getting this idea that her childish apprehension of others, her naive apprehension of others, her solipsistic apprehension of others, her belief that she is the only one who is real, she is the only one with interiority, even as that realness and that interiority are being violated or subsumed or mixed somehow, right? She cannot position Theodora as a person with an interior life, as a person with a history, as a person who might be keeping secrets. And it is hard here, and I know that this is the turning point for many readers of the book who just take against Theodora right now, but if we are subscribing to queer theory, and I think that we are, then Theodora has a girlfriend at home, which means that not only can she not bring this stray cat home with her, which, if we are indulging in queer theory, is a particularly pointed bit of like 1950s, early 1960s slang there, right? She can't take this stray cat home with her because what will her partner think? And also, she can't reveal her secret. She can't show Eleanor who she really is. It's a very complicated world here. And what is most interesting about it is not that Theodora is conflicted, though that is interesting enough. What's interesting is that Eleanor cannot credit or understand or process the idea that Theodora might be conflicted about it. It's all about Theodora's relationship with her. There is something deeply, as I say, solipsistic, something narcissistic about how Eleanor sees reactions and interactions and relationships, right? So we then have the trip to the brook in which Eleanor is separated from Theodora and Luke, and we get this great kind of drawing apart of the supernatural world and the domestic world here, as Theodora and Luke are clearly talking, and Theodora is uncomfortable because they are presumably talking about exactly this moment, right? This event here. That's when they're reconnected afterwards. But Eleanor, meanwhile, is having this communion with this invisible figure, this invisible being, this avatar of the house, or whatever, however we interpret that moment, I guess. So from here, we get this fantastic series of short scenes. I had kind of glossed over these, I think, in previous readings. It was only today that I was struck by how brilliant these these short scenes are, these very fragmented scenes, these very atypical scenes. These are not like the rest of the book. They come very quickly, very briefly. They're usually just, 10 lines maybe of attributed dialogue, and then like a little snatch of description, and then we're out. We bounce onto something else. This begins with Eleanor hiding behind the summer house, hiding in the shadows behind the summer house, listening in on Luke and Theodora. She's then listening at the parlor door to Arthur and Dr. Montague, and she's listening from the dining room door to Mrs. Dudley and Mrs. Montague bonding and lamenting the loss of innocence in the young. It's terrible what the world is doing to the young folk. However will they get by without their innocence? This was happening in 1959, just to show you that there is nothing new under the sun. And these scenes, you'll note, are more relaxed, more naturalistic, more comfortable, less heightened, perhaps, might be the way to say it, than many of the scenes that we've had earlier in the book. They seem less performative than many of the scenes that we've had earlier in the book. We just kind of have this relationship, right? We have a very companionable relationship between Theodora and Luke, which again, we might be inclined to read as flirty, or Eleanor might be inclined to read as flirty, and we're seeing it through her eyes. We get this great scene between Dr. Montague and Arthur, the former clearly having no goddamn time for the latter, even though the latter is just this kind of, bluff doofus of a guy whose politics, I'm sure, are incredibly bad, but still, nonetheless, it's a nice little comic scene. And then the surprisingly touching scene, the only scene that Mrs. Montague gets in which she is a human being in the entire book, and she's talking to, of all people, Mrs. Dudley. And the two of them are just coming to life. The two of them are just so warm and companionable. And maybe there's, something satirical happening there, that these two vile women find a kind of awful toxic sorority, the one with the other. But I think that there's actually something else happening there. And it is partly this idea of the house giving Eleanor a sense of something that is not truly solipsistic, right? Because the house knows what is happening. And that's where we kind of extend that idea out. We have these three glimpses of Eleanor listening behind the building, behind the summer house, in the shadows, or listening at the door, or listening at the door to the parlor room, or the door to the dining room. And I'm beginning to wonder now if those are true. I'm beginning to wonder now if that is literally where Eleanor is, or if she is now just sensing things within the house, because we're getting these moments, right? They're filtered through here, where she just suddenly, we will cut out to something else that is happening in the house, and Eleanor will have a consciousness of it. There's a great beat, I forget now exactly where it comes, and I don't think that I pulled it on the slide, but there's a great beat about a conversation that is happening, and then she feels in this moment of dramatic tension, this moment of emotional tension, there is the sense of the ash collapsing in the fireplace in the other room. And she's not there and no one else is there, but she feels that experience nonetheless, which is a really great kind of moment of connection there. Let's move on. Yes, I did pull a slide here for, yes. This is because after we've done the three scenes, we circle back to Theo and Luke here. "I'm Eleanor," Theo said, "because I am wearing blue. I love my love with an E because she is ethereal. Her name is Eleanor, and she lives in expectation." She's being spiteful, Eleanor thought remotely. From a great distance, it seemed she could watch these people and listen to them. Now she thought Theo is being spiteful, and Luke is trying to be nice. Luke is ashamed of himself for laughing at me, and he's ashamed of Theo for being spiteful. "Luke," Theodora said with a half glance at Eleanor, "come and sing to me again." "Later," Luke said uncomfortably. "The doctor has just set up the chessmen." He turned away in some haste. Theodora, piqued, leaned her head against the back of her chair and closed her eyes, clearly determined not to speak. Eleanor sat, looking down at her hands, and listened to the sounds of the house. Somewhere upstairs a door swung quietly shut. A bird touched the tower briefly and flew off. In the kitchen the stove was settling and cooling with little soft creakings. An animal, a rabbit, moved through the bushes by the summer house. She could even hear, with her new awareness of the house, the dust drifting gently in the attics, the wood aging. Only the library was close to her. She could not hear the heavy breathing of Mrs. Montague and Arthur over their planchette, nor their little excited questions. She could not hear the books rotting or rust seeping into the circular iron stairway to the tower. In the little parlor she could hear, without raising her eyes, Theodora's small, irritated tappings and the quiet sound of the chessmen being set down. She heard when the library door slammed open, and then the sharp, angry sound of footsteps coming to the little parlor, and then all of them turned as Mrs. Montague opened the door and marched in. So, Eleanor is connected to the experience of the house, whatever that means. She can feel things that the house feels. She can hear and see things that the house is experiencing, abstracted from herself. There is this I don't know, this mirroring of her own consciousness, perhaps, in the house. Again, any kind of definition of this is going to be very provocative, and I do not want to pin ourselves down to precisely in terms of a specific interpretive maneuver here. But we can see, we have the evidence, right, that something here is resonant within her. Something here is connecting her sense of herself, her core identity. It's no coincidence here in this passage that we're playing with, I am Eleanor because I am wearing blue. I love my love with an E because she is ethereal. Her name is Eleanor and she lives in expectation, right? Kind of echoing all of that. I am Eleanor, I am wearing red, you are not wearing red, therefore you are Theo, that we had earlier in the book, right? These tokens of identity. It's no coincidence that we're revisiting that here as we're discussing, as we're feeling, as we're exploring the idea that Eleanor and the house are to some extent becoming one. And I love how this is drawn in, right? She's listening to the sounds of the house. Somewhere upstairs, a door swung quietly shut. Okay. Maybe she can just hear that, maybe. But a bird touched the tower briefly and flew off. It's fantastic, right? In the kitchen, the stove was settling and cooling with little soft creakings. An animal, a rabbit, moved through the bushes by the summer house. She's aware, with her new awareness of the house, she says here, she's aware that this is not just listening to things, that this is not just, the house is quiet and she can hear these things. She's aware that she is experiencing things beyond herself, and that this is revealing a deeper connection. And this is the point where Mrs. Montague bursts in, claiming that all of the ruckus and the hubbub have ruined Planchette, that Planchette will not speak with her now. And then Eleanor hears the song, the children's song, In and Out the Window, which I didn't know is a real song. This is an American folk song. This is an American children's song composed by Lou Pollock in the 1920s. There are, of course, as is the way with folk songs and things of this sort, there are innumerable different versions, but primarily there are 4 stanzas of this song. Round and round the village, round and round the village, round and round the village, as we've done before, right? At which point the children are gathered in a ring and the leader will walk around the outside of the ring. Then we do In and Out the Windows, repeat that 3 times, as we've done before. And the leader is like weaving figure 8s through, I guess not figure 8s, right? Weaving like a slalom through the bodies of the children in the ring. Then Stand and Face Your Partner, as we get here, where the leader steps into the ring and faces a partner, chooses a person out of the group. And then, evocatively, brilliantly, fascinatingly, the last stanza traditionally is, follow me to London, follow me to London, follow me to London, as we've done before. And what's so great here is that there are 2 separate versions of this song. There are 2 separate versions of the way that this plays out, because in some versions, follow me to London, as we've done before, the leader leaves the ring and the partner, the chosen partner, now takes up the mantle of leader. But the other version is follow me to London, as we've done before, and the partner, the chosen person, leaves the ring, and we do it all again with 1 fewer people. And I find the resonance of that really, really fascinating. I'm struck by that. Excuse me. So, but in any case, we must then move into chapter 9. And to our last, what do we got here? 4 slides, I want to say. 4 or 5, maybe? Depending how many of these I actually pulled. We'll find out. And we begin with, we begin with mischief, don't we? We begin with Eleanor becoming the spectre in the house. And exactly what this means in terms of the recapitulation of prior events, right? This is also the point in the book where people several times over ask themselves or ask each other, how long have we been here? Time has gone soft, time has lost its meaning. And those inquiries always have answers, right? They always do seem to be resolved, but there is a sense that time is loose within the house. And we might tie back some of these events, at least, if you're so inclined. We might tie back some of the things that Eleanor is doing here to the events that we've experienced earlier in the book, which doesn't make them less supernatural, right? Just makes them differently supernatural. Dancing, the carpet soft under her feet, she came to the door behind which Theodora slept. Faithless Theo, she thought, cruel, laughing Theo, wake up, wake up, wake up, and pounded and slapped the door, laughing, and shook the doorknob and then ran swiftly down the hall to Luke's door and pounded. Wake up, she thought, wake up and be faithless. None of them will open their doors, she thought. They will sit inside with the blankets pressed around them, shivering and wondering what is going to happen to them next. Wake up, she thought, pounding on the doctor's door. I dare you to open your door and come out to see me dancing in the hall of Hill House. Then Theodora startled her by calling out wildly, Nell? Nell! Doctor! Luke, Nell's not here! Poor house, Eleanor thought. I had forgotten Eleanor. Now they will have to open their doors. And she ran quickly down the stairs, hearing behind her the doctor's voice raised anxiously and Theodora calling, "Nell? Eleanor?" What fools they are, she thought. Now I will have to go into the library. "Mother, mother," she whispered, "mother," and stopped at the library door, sick. Behind her, she could hear them talking upstairs in the hall. Funny, she thought, I can feel the whole house. And heard even Mrs. Montague protesting, and Arthur, and then the doctor. Clearly, we've got to go look for her. Everyone, please, hurry. Elizabeth says in the chat, this was my favorite part, and I think it's my favorite part too. I think it is so incredibly dark and disorienting and also brilliant, right? Because it's got all this feeling of fairy and of excess and of transgression. And it's wonderful to see Eleanor be so active, right? We get all of this motive force, all of this momentum building and building and building. And then we get possibly the most audacious formal maneuver that Jackson gives us in the entire book, I dare say, right? And I'm not going to get too into it because I think that it is not in the analysis of the event, but it is in the emotional experience of the event that its narrative power lies. I'm talking here, of course, about the clearly foreshadowed beat in the library, the rescue of Eleanor by Luke, the dodging of our expectations, right? The fact that Eleanor survives what would be the kind of horror beat that we might expect from a less precise, less calculated book, right? This is exactly how these things play out. What Jackson is doing here is rejecting the idea of Chekhov's gun. She is rejecting the idea that you put all of the evidence, I was describing the odd and peculiar structure of horror stories right at the beginning of tonight's session, and this is an example of that. You put all of the pieces on the table where the audience can see them, and then you let the story play out by ratcheting up the tension, by tightening the screws, by forcing things into their ultimate exigency, and oftentimes that takes the form of something that has been established as an internal trope of this kind of horror story being played out again. In this instance, we've heard the story of the suicide in the library, and now we're getting perilously close to that happening again, and then Jackson dodges it. But by dodging it, she's not just playing games. This is what is so fantastic. She's not just teasing you, right? This isn't just a ploy, a plot, a trick by the author. Instead, she grounds us again. She takes us all the way back to breakfast, right? We crash into this uncomfortable breakfast the next morning, and the fragile domesticity of it, and every line is tightening the screws further. She's actually driving Eleanor further away from the rest of our core cast. There's no moment of reconciliation here, right? Because that's the other thing that I suppose you would do if you were a more gently minded horror writer, You would have this moment of replication, of recapitulation. You would have Eleanor walking in the footsteps of the victim that was in the library before, and then have her be rescued by Luke because the power of love overcomes, or have her be rescued by Theodora, or have her be rescued by Mrs. Dudley, who has shaken off the curse of Hill House, right? There are infinite numbers of ways that you can tell exactly that story. But instead what happens is that Jackson is anchoring us back in Eleanor's experience and allowing not the physical consequence, because the physical consequence will come and it will be almost a hideous, harrowing afterthought. But she allows the emotional consequence of this, the mental consequence, the supernatural consequence to play out, and does so beautifully, right? Because this is the last day of the book. We begin with the awkward breakfast. We get the casual revelation here, the provocative revelation here that, in fact, there's nothing wrong with Theodora's room or with Theodora's clothes, which is challenging, right? I think wherever you stand in terms of the supernatural elements of The Haunting of Hill House, the fact that there's nothing wrong with Theodora's clothes is odd. It's very, it's strange, particularly because the door is locked, right? We're coming back to this idea. I don't know. You could speculate, I suppose, that Mrs. Dudley had snuck in there and laundered everything and washed down the walls and done whatever was necessary. But that's clearly not the case. We're not allowed to sink into that assumption. We get something very different here. So that is provocative no matter where you sit, I think, in terms of our understanding of the supernatural dimension of The Haunting of Hill House. But then we get to the point, right? Which is that Eleanor has to leave. It is worse than dying. It is worse than whatever fate awaits her here in Hill House. She has to leave. And her story now falls apart. She's telling the truth. Oh, excuse me. I again, did I skip out on a slide here? I thought I had pulled this one where she's talking about it. I guess I didn't. Look at that. I do apologize. Well, anyway, she decides that she doesn't want to go. Right? She doesn't understand. Firstly, that is her response. It is this kind of mounting incredulity. She does not want to leave. She is not ready to leave. She cannot leave. She explains that she has no home to go back to. She has this sequence of kind of ratcheting up in terms of her incredulity. We're getting this idea of Dr. Montague presents this idea that he says, once away from here, she will be herself again, right? Which is highlighting, is emphasizing this idea of the synonymity of Eleanor and Hill House, but is also at this point doing something really interesting, right? When we look at the story in terms of its full sweep, we're also seeing something really interesting happening here in terms of identity as a concept and home as a concept. That is how Hill House is being positioned for Eleanor and for us through this back part. It's not that she's tied to the house, that the house is her, that we can't remove her from it, like it's some kind of symbiotic relationship, that there's some kind of, psychic resonance. We don't get into that. She feels that it is her home. She feels that it is where she belongs. She feels it is where she ought to be. And situating this notion of home as a part of as an integrated fundamental part of one's identity, I think is really fascinating and is something that I'm going to be paying close attention to the next time that I read this book, which is not going to be long from now. I think I'm probably, if this isn't already on your list as a as a yearly Halloween read, then I don't know. So let's get to it. We've got 2 slides left. We're going to look at the very end of the book and the final consequences for Eleanor. They waved back at her dutifully, standing still, watching her. They will watch me down the drive as far as they can see, she thought. It is only civil for them to look at me until I am out of sight. So now I am going. Journeys end in lovers' meeting. But I won't go, she thought, and laughed aloud to herself. Hill House is not as easy as they are. Just by telling me to go away, they can't make me leave. Not if Hill House means me to stay. Go away, Eleanor, she chanted aloud. Go away, Eleanor. We don't want you anymore. Not in our Hill House. Go away, Eleanor. You can't stay here. But I can, she sang. But I can. They don't make the rules around here. They can't turn me out or shut me out or laugh at me or hide from me. I won't go. And Hill House belongs to me. With what she perceived as quick cleverness, she pressed her foot down hard on the accelerator. They can't run fast enough to catch me this time, she thought. And by now they must be beginning to realize. I wonder who notices first. Luke, almost certainly. I can hear them calling now, she thought, and the little footsteps running through Hill House and the soft sound of the hills pressing closer. I'm really doing it, she thought, turning the wheel to send the car directly at the great tree at the curve of the driveway. I am really doing it. I am doing this all by myself now. At last, this is me. I am really, really doing it by myself. In the unending, crashing second before the car hurled into the tree, she thought clearly, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why don't they stop me? Which, if, as we have established previously, The Haunting of Hill House is notable in part because it begins with the best first chapter, the first paragraph in any horror novel ever, I think there's a really strong argument that it ends with the best couple of paragraphs, couple of passages here in any horror novel ever. I find this so tremendously striking. The heartbreak. The slide that I thought I had, by the way, that I now regret very much not pulling, I did write it in my notes and then I guess just didn't pull it right before we started tonight, is the goodbye scene between Eleanor and Theo. It is so lovely, and I think that we genuinely see there, again, right, the real Theodora. We get to see the real kind of expression of affection and of connection and of intimacy. There is something very strong and powerful between them. I take it as completely sincere, that she is so hurt by the thought in that moment that Eleanor just wasn't going to say goodbye to her is so hard for her. And then we get this moment of reconnection, a kind of reconnection, right? Which serves only, in the imaginary, I suppose, to make this moment all the more harrowing. Because Eleanor has, Eleanor is, right? How do we understand what is happening right here on the page? Because we're getting the justification. We're getting the explanation. We're getting this sense of as Hugh says, was she doing it or was the house doing it? The house has found a spirit that it can communicate with and it doesn't want to let it go. And Elizabeth says, and I think the others are being played by the house in their own ways, made insecure and their worst selves. That's a really interesting point, Elizabeth. Yes, that we just haven't circled around to. But again, Hugh, I think is right on the money with the most important question in the entire book, right? This is it. How the hell do we read the ambiguity of that final line? Because it's one thing, you can imagine this novel cutting off what is that? 2 sentences, 4 sentences, I suppose, depending on how we interpret that run-on comma there. But if you cut that last paragraph, you can imagine this book ending with almost as much emotional impact. If the last line of this book is, I am doing this all by myself now, at last this is me, I am really, really doing it by myself. And then the book ends, and that's it. Then you are left with this incredibly powerful kind of manifestation, this realization, this fullest exploration of this question of identity and of being and of agency, right? How do you take charge of your life? Well, one of the ways in which you can most powerfully take charge of your life is to end it. There is something there. And we would speculate, of course, about the influence of the house and exactly what was happening here. The house is in her, that the house belongs to me, right? Look at the ambiguity there of whether she belongs to the house or the house belongs to her, that there is a degree to which these notions of identity have overlapped to the point that they are now coterminous, right? We're not sure what is Eleanor and what is the house. That is what brings us here. But then the voice of the narrator intrudes clearly and unambiguously for the first time in how many pages and how many chapters, right? In the unending crashing second before the car hurled into the tree, she thought clearly, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why don't they stop me? Now, it's tempting, of course, to read that as a moment of lucidity, to read that as a moment of fear, to read that as a moment of, I don't know, right? How do we understand this? Do we understand this as the Eleanor in the clutches of a mania, in the clutches of this supernaturally kindled desire, the possession of the house, that the house has taken her over, and in that final second, in that unending crashing second, that lucidity returns, that she has this moment of clarity and of clear thought, and even then doesn't understand it, right? She doesn't, why am I doing this? Why don't they stop me? Is in its own way also juvenile. It's also childish. It's also naive, right? If the bounds of your agency in the world are limited to what you are permitted to do by figures of authority, right, to people who have a certain control over you, that is the life of a child. That is the life of someone who has not yet come into their majority, not yet come into their fullest agency. How do we understand the balance here, the trick here? Well, I'm not sure that we do. I'm not sure that it is resolvable, which, I mean, damn, it's the coward's way out, right? But I genuinely think that one of the brilliant things about Hill House is that it is so perfectly balanced on this knife point of ambiguity. Ambiguity, particularly in modern critical circles, is used so often as the kind of argument that people make about canonicity, right? The kind of argument that people make about what is or is not a valid interpretation. And the idea that there is ambiguity in the text is oftentimes used as a means of smuggling in your own preferred interpretation. You know, they never say clearly that this doesn't happen, so I'm going to choose to believe that it absolutely does happen, right? Okay, you can stretch a text. Texts are malleable, and the more skilled you are as well, no, that's not true, right? Because there's definitely a bell curve there, like an inverse bell curve, I suppose. I was going to say that the more skilled you are as a reader, the more skilled you are as a critic of texts, the more you can stretch a text. And that is true up to a point. And then you become a skilled enough reader that you stop stretching texts and you start paying attention to what the text is actually saying, and you allow the preservation of ambiguity. But true ambiguity leaves you in this limbic space where all possibilities are true, because they are irresolvable. They cannot be collapsed down into a simple, what we would call in philosophy like a truth function or a truth statement. You can't bring them down to this is clearly true and this is clearly not. If you want to tell me that The Haunting of Hill House, though it has, right, I'm not going to really permit, like on my most generous day, I'm not really going to permit you to come in and tell me that The Haunting of Hill House has no supernatural elements, because I just don't think that is true. I think that there are clearly things. You get very quickly to the point of diminishing returns if you kind of take that kind of most cynical, most rationalist approach to this text, which I actually think is something that we're getting from the text itself. I think that was one of the narrative functions of Mrs. Montague, is to say, come on, you can go along with the magic just a little bit. You can go along with it just a little bit. But if you tell me that The Haunting of Hill House is a perfectly straightforward ghost story in which we situate a character with terrible mental illness, with terrible self-esteem issues, with arrested development, with a real guilt. We haven't, how the hell did we get to the end of this book and not even talk about Eleanor's feeling of guilt about the death of her mother, whether she killed her mother or not, right? Whether it was conscious or not, whether it was deliberate or not, she feels culpable for the death of her mother because she didn't wake up. And that obviously is something that she is, retroactively, we can understand that is something she's been carrying with her through the whole book. Is this the story of someone tragically just cracking under tremendous pressure? You can argue that. I think that the text supports the read, right? It is there. You can definitely take that perspective. Is Hill House itself some Lovecraftian entity that lurks in this forested valley and waits to consume the innocent that come in, right? Again, because one of the qualities I've been maybe casually critical of Eleanor for being childish, for being immature, for being childlike, for being innocent is another way of presenting that in a text that explicitly positions childlikeness and innocence as virtuous, that these are things to be protected, that these are things to be valued, things to be cherished. And what we see there in Eleanor's entanglement with the house and her ultimate fate could easily be seen as the house once again taking innocence, feasting on innocence. That is perhaps the most continuous interpretation, the most compatible interpretation with the story that we get of Hugh Crane and his immediate family, right? There are all of these possible interpretations, and all of which are valid. And that's the power of ambiguity. That's the genius of Shirley Jackson, because this is a great story, right? I think that you could end this story in a much less sophisticated, much less ambitious way, and it would be still a masterclass of the form. But in this moment, and in the preservation of the ambiguity of this moment, Jackson elevates out of just horror into something that is more transcendent, into something that is more provocative. She elevates this into the realm of the philosophical. Really, truly, I think that is true. I want to wrap up here because God knows I'm already over time. I don't even have my watch on tonight, so I can't even tell you how over time I am, but it's a bit, I'll tell you. Let's take a look here at, because if the ending of the book is not great enough, we then get the epilogue, which is a masterpiece. Mrs. Sanderson was enormously relieved to hear that Dr. Montague and his party had left Hill House. She would have turned them out, she told the family lawyer, if Dr. Montague had shown any sign of wanting to stay. Theodora's friend, mollified and contrite, was delighted to see Theodora back so soon. Luke took himself off to Paris, where his aunt fervently hoped he would stay for a while. Dr. Montague finally retired from active scholarly pursuits after the cool, almost contemptuous reception of his preliminary article analyzing the psychic phenomena of Hill House. Hill House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, its walls continued upright. Bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. I now have to follow that by concluding our unit on the haunting of Hill House, I guess, which is not necessarily going to be easy. So I will just say, holy smokes, you guys, thank you so much for choosing The Haunting of Hill House, for letting me spend the last 3 weeks read and think and absorb and bathe in this book. I have absolutely loved it. This is interesting, right? Hugh is calling this out. So Eleanor is not there as well. Whatever walked there walked alone. I don't think that precludes the possibility of there being multiple things there. Simply that, okay, how can I put this, right? I don't think that this means that there is only one inhabitant of Hill House. It does mean that the inhabitants of Hill House are not in community, that they are not connected to each other. They may have a singular relationship to the house, but if we accept the speculation that Sophia is the childlike ghost that we assume or that we infer is haunting Hill House, right? If we take that as read, then she is still there and Eleanor is still there, but they are not there together. They do not have community. They are separate and isolated and maybe isolated in this singular relationship. I'm scrolling back through here. Eleanor was an imposter that needed to be vanquished, says Hugh. That's interesting. I wanted to think on that. So you're reading this last piece as a kind of a statement of that we are directly, not just thematically reasserting what is true at the beginning of the novel here at the end of the novel, but kind of resetting to first principles. That Eleanor is gone now and Hill House remains as it was before. That's really interesting. And again, right, another potential read. I don't know exactly how I would break down or even seek to break down what it is that the house wants. And this is something that I'm not, super unfamiliar with, you guys, right? Like, I've spent a lot of time talking about The Lord of the Rings. I've spent a lot of time analyzing on like a very close reading level the influence of the ring, which is a very clear example of this supernatural force that will touch and manipulate and cause things to be without a direct like causal relationship on the page. That's really interesting. I will be thinking about that, Hugh. Thank you for that. Yeah, stay tuned to the Discord or, I don't know, some kind of bonus episode in the future where I might just circle back around to this. I have been told that the only one that is, I guess, Mike Flanagan fans like The Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix series, but the responses that I have had from people who like that show is you should really only watch this show if you're a Mike Flanagan fan. And I am, I must say, not so far in my life, at least a Mike Flanagan fan. But I have had a couple people reach out and say, actually, the Liam Neeson, Catherine Zeta-Jones 1999 adaptation is really fun and you should watch it. So, I don't know. I still got a couple hours of Halloween left here in the great state of Oklahoma, so maybe I will do that. But before we do that, we have to take care of a little bit of business right here on Stars and Swords, because this is the end of our what was it, the 13th unit, looking at The Haunting of Hill House, and we have to talk about the 14th unit. We have to move on here. We have to be considerate of our next adventure, and because, the necessity is how the invention gets in. I think that's how the quote goes. I put up a poll on Patreon yesterday to allow all of the patrons of Stars and Swords and Next Word the opportunity to pick what I am describing as influential science fiction, but what I am really defining as turning point science fiction. We have never yet studied a piece of classic science fiction, and now is the time. Our 14th unit is going to be a discussion of well, here we are. I'm leading into it like the poll is still open. The choice has been made, you guys. We are not, in fact, going to study Golden Age science fiction. We are not going to be studying Victorian science fiction. We're not going to be studying The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, the 1895 novel, 1895 novel, I believe it is, in fact. No, I've got it written down here as 85. Maybe it is 85. A fantastic story, right? Such a prescient story, such a definitive novel. It's so rare that you get a novel that really comes along and shapes an entire genre, and that is exactly, I would argue, what The Time Machine does. Yes, there are other novels around the same time. Yes, Jules Verne also has a dog in that race, I suppose. But for me, it is The Time Machine, and The Time Machine is the most influential of all of those early Victorian era science fiction books. We're not going to be talking about that. We're not going to be talking about Isaac Asimov's series of short stories published through the 1940s and then bound together into a single volume and published in 1950, Foundation, which means sadly we're not going to be talking about the Lee Pace Apple Plus adaptation of Foundation, which I've really been looking for an excuse to watch, but that's fine. We're not going to be talking, surprisingly, this was the one that my money was on, I must admit. I thought that we were going to wind up talking about Robert Heinlein's 1961 novel, Stranger in a Strange Land, which so perfectly balances on the turning point between the Golden Age and the New Wave of science fiction, that the book, the interpretation of the book changes almost immediately after its publication, because we are leaving the Golden Age behind and moving into New Wave science fiction, which I find so fascinating, and Heinlein himself was so frustrated by. He's a fascinating and controversial figure too. Instead, we're not going to talk about any of those books. We are going to talk about William Gibson's 1984 cyberpunk dystopian novel, the first of the Sprawl trilogy. We are going to be talking about the novel Neuromancer. We are going to be engaged in a cyberpunk heist with the biggest ideas in all of science fiction. Again, right? I was just talking about H.G. Wells inventing science fiction with The Time Machine. William Gibson invents cyberpunk, absolutely, with Neuromancer. And it is a really tight little story. It is, again, stuffed full of the most interesting, engaging, provocative ideas, fantastic characters. We're going to meet Case. We're going to meet Molly Millions. We're going to meet Wintermute. We're going to be talking about, the idea of the future as a tangible place from the perspective of 1984. If you're not sure about cyberpunk as a genre, maybe you've seen Blade Runner. Maybe you've seen one of the Blade Runner ancillary properties. Maybe you've seen, other kinds of 1980s into the 1990s takes on this near future dystopia. We're going to be talking about a world in which corporate oligarchs have an immoral amount of power. So, that's going to be fun. Really talk about the decline of Western capitalism as we go. It's going to be a great discussion, I think. So I'm not entirely sure how that is going to break down. I do think, in fact, I have, let me show you here. I think we're going to spend 5 weeks. It looks like it's going to be 5 weeks. I will announce right now, next week, November 7th, is going to be a skip week for Stars and Swords. We've been running back-to-back units. I did always intend to take a week off between units. I've done a terrible job of that in the, almost 2 years that we've been running Stars and Swords here. So next week is going to be a skip week. I have a lot of reading to do. I want to really immerse myself again in Gibson and in Neuromancer, and to look at the consequences of this book and how cyberpunk takes shape. But we are then going to come back on November 14th with just part 1. We're going to look at Chiba City Blues, the first part of Neuromancer. That is not a terribly long reading, but we are going to be doing, some of the traditional background stuff there too. We're going to be talking a little bit about Gibson. We're going to be talking a little bit about where cyberpunk comes from. And then November 21st, we're going to be doing the Shopping Expedition part 2. I think we're going to spend 5 weeks in total looking at Neuromancer, which is actually perfect for the schedule. So stay tuned for more information on that. If you've never read Neuromancer, I really must encourage you to read it. If you like heist movies, right? If you don't think you like cyberpunk science fiction, I completely get it. But if you like a heist movie, if you like a story in which, the first half of the story is putting the team together, and then the back half of the story is the heist, and if you think that would be fun, if you're also simultaneously engaging with some ideas about a completely destroyed and ruinous late-stage capitalism, with the idea of overly powerful oligarchs, with the idea of artificial intelligence, hey, how relevant is this book in the year 2025? Then I think that you'll really genuinely enjoy William Gibson's writing. And the great thing about Gibson, much like Jackson, is that you can go and read the first paragraph of Neuromancer, and you will know if you will like that book. It's all just right there, right from basically the first sentence, in fact, is extremely, extremely punchy. That is going to do it for this outsized episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you guys so much for joining me here on this Halloween night. I'm going to, go see if there's any candy left, I guess. I don't have a terribly sweet tooth. I might just go and see if there's any bourbon left and instead indulge myself here on All Hallows Eve. I hope that you are all having a good day. Hugh, I hope that your Saturday, I guess it must be Saturday there by now, is good. Elizabeth, I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday. To everyone listening at home, thank you so much for joining me for The Haunting of Hill House. I hope you will join me also for the cyberpunk future of William Gibson's Neuromancer. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Until then, do please take care. Good night, all.